The antiseptic smell of Meadowbrook Nursing Home hit Detective Marcus Chen like a physical wall, sharp and medicinal, cutting through the November chill that clung to his leather jacket. Beside him, his German Shepherd partner, Ranger's black, ears swiveled forward, nostrils flaring as he processed the complex symphony of scents that Marcus could barely begin to comprehend. The linoleum floors squeaked under Marcus's worn boots as they moved through the facility's main corridor, past wheelchairs and walkers, past the soft murmur of daytime television shows filtering from common areas. Marcus's weathered hands gripped the missing persons file tighter than necessary, the manila folder bearing the weight of 4.5 decades of unanswered questions. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, age 7 when she vanished from her family's backyard in 1978. Blonde hair, green eyes, wearing a red polka dot dress that her grandmother had sewn by hand. The case that had haunted 3 generations of detectives, the ghost that refused to rest in the cold case files. We're looking for anyone who might have worked here in the late 70s, early 80s. Marcus explained to the facility director, Mrs. Henderson, a matronly woman whose kind eyes couldn't quite hide the nervous energy radiating from her rigid posture. There's been a development in an old case. Ranger's head tilted, his amber eyes fixed on something beyond the conversation, beyond the polite exchanges and careful questions. His tail remained still, not the casual alertness of a working dog, but something deeper, attention that Marcus had learned to read like scripture during their 5 years together. The dog's nostrils continued their methodical work, cataloging every scent molecule that drifted through the building's recycled air. Most of our staff from that era have retired or passed on, Mrs. Henderson said, her fingers unconsciously smoothing her cardigan. But we do have Mr. Kowalski in room 12. He worked maintenance here for over 30 years before becoming a resident himself. Alzheimer's, I'm afraid, but he has his lucid moments. The words hung in the air like dust motes caught in afternoon light filtering through the home's institutional windows. Room 12. Marcus felt the familiar tingle of intuition, the same sixth sense that had guided him through 15 years of detective work. Through the labyrinth of human deception and buried truth, they moved deeper into the facility, past residents, in their wheelchairs, some alert and watching their progress with curious eyes, others lost in the private worlds that age and illness had created. The walls were painted in soothing pastels, sage green and cream yellow, designed to calm, to comfort, to create the illusion of home in a place where people came to wait for their final chapter. Ranger's behavior shifted as they approached the residential wing. His stride became more purposeful, his head lowered slightly as if following an invisible trail. Marcus had seen this posture countless times in their work together, tracking missing persons through dense forests, locating evidence in abandoned buildings, finding what others had given up for lost. But there was something different now, something that made the hair on Marcus's arms rise beneath his jacket sleeves. That's odd, Mrs. Henderson murmured, glancing at Ranger. He seems to know where he's going. They turned a corner, and Marcus saw the hallway stretch before them, a long corridor lined with numbered doors, each one a portal to someone's final act. Room 8, 9, 10, 11. Ranger's pace quickened, his breathing becoming more focused, more intent. His shoulders tensed beneath his thick coat, and Marcus felt the subtle vibration through the leash that connected them, the wordless communication that had saved both their lives more than once. Room 12 sat at the end of the hallway, its door slightly ajar, allowing a sliver of afternoon light to escape into the corridor. From within came the soft sound of classical music's melancholy and beautiful that seemed to drift through the air like a half-remembered dream. Ranger stopped abruptly, his entire body going rigid, ears pricked forward with laser-like focus. Something's not right, Marcus whispered, more to himself than to Mrs. Henderson. He'd learned to trust Ranger's instincts above all else, even above his own carefully honed detective skills. The dog was never wrong, not about the things that mattered. Mrs. Henderson knocked gently on the doorframe. Mr. Kowalski, you have some visitors. The music stopped. In the silence that followed, Marcus could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the weight of the missing persons file in his hands, could sense Ranger's tension coiling tighter like a spring ready to release. There was movement from within the room, the soft shuffle of slippers against carpet, the creak of an old chair, the whisper of fabric against fabric. Come in, came a voice from inside, thin and reedy with age. but carrying an undertone that made Marcus's detective instincts flare like struck matches. Ranger whined softly, a sound so low it was almost inaudible, but Marcus felt it resonate through his bones. The dog's tail remained perfectly still, his amber eyes fixed on that partially open door, with an intensity that spoke of recognition, of something found that had been lost for far too long. The years had been unkind to Stanley Kowalski, carving deep lines into his weathered face and bending his spine into a permanent question mark. He sat in a worn recliner beside his room's single window, afternoon light casting half his features in shadow while illuminating the other half in stark relief. His hands, once strong enough to fix broken pipes and replace burned-out bulbs, now trembled slightly as they rested on his lap, liver spotted and fragile as autumn leaves. "Mr. Kowalski," Marcus began, settling into the room's only other chair, while Ranger positioned himself near the door. "I'm Detective Chen. I wanted to ask you about your time working here, specifically about the late 70s. The old man's eyes, still sharp despite the fog of Alzheimer's that occasionally rolled in like weather, focused on Marcus with surprising clarity. 1978 was a difficult year, he said without prompting, his voice carrying the weight of decades. That was the year everything changed. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. 45 years, and the first person they'd spoken to mentioned that exact year without being asked. Ranger's ears twitched, his body remaining perfectly still but somehow more alert, as if every fiber of his being was tuned to frequencies that human ears couldn't detect. "What made it difficult?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice gentle. He'd learned that memories from that era were fragile things, easily shattered by the wrong word or tone. Stanley's gaze drifted to the window, where the November sky was beginning to darken toward evening. "I was young then, thought I knew right from wrong, thought the world made sense." His fingers worked at the fabric of his bathrobe, a nervous habit that spoke of buried anxiety. "There was a little girl, such a sweet little girl. She would come to visit sometimes, with her grandmother who worked in the kitchen." The file seemed to grow heavier in Marcus's hands. Sarah Morrison's grandmother had indeed worked at various local establishments to make ends meet after her husband died. The timeline was beginning to align with terrifying precision. "I remember her dress," Stanley continued, his voice taking on the distant quality of someone reaching across decades. "Red with white polka dots. She liked to help her grandmother, would carry the dinner trays to the residence sometimes. Always smiling, always curious about everything." Ranger made a sound deep in his chest. Not quite a whine, not quite a growl, something that spoke of recognition, of sense and memories that transcended human understanding. Marcus had worked with enough canine units to know that dogs could detect things buried for decades, could sense the lingering traces of human presence long after all visible evidence had vanished. "Mr. Kowalski, do you remember what happened to that little girl?" Marcus asked, his detective's training warring with the growing certainty that they were standing at the edge of a truth that had been buried for almost half a century. The old man's hands stopped their nervous movement. For a moment, his face went completely blank, as if someone had erased the chalkboard of his expression. When awareness returned to his eyes, there was something different. There were a combination of fear and relief that Marcus had seen countless times in people who'd carried terrible secrets for too long. "She never left," Stanley whispered, his voice so soft that Marcus had to lean forward to catch the words. "I tried to tell them, tried to explain, but nobody would listen to an old maintenance man. They said I was confused, said the stress of the job was getting to me." The room seemed to grow colder, despite the heating system's steady hum. Ranger shifted position, his attention now focused entirely on a specific section of the room's far-wallen area near what appeared to be a built-in bookshelf that looked like it had been part of the original construction. "Where is she, Mr. Kowalski?" Marcus asked, though part of him already knew the answer from the way Ranger's body had gone rigid, from the way the old man's eyes kept darting toward that same section of wall. Stanley's weathered face crumpled, tears beginning to track down his cheeks like rain on window glass. "I was supposed to fix the heating in the old storage room, the one behind the wall there. It was scheduled for renovation, going to become part of an expanded room. But when I broke through... His voice trailed off, lost in memories too terrible to voice. But Marcus no longer needed words. Ranger's behavior, the timeline, the impossibility of a 7-year-old girl simply vanishing without a trace. It all pointed to the same horrific conclusion. She was already there, Marcus said, not really a question. Stanley nodded, his tears falling freely now. 45 years I've lived with it. 45 years I've wondered if I should have done something different, said something different. But who was going to believe an old maintenance worker over someone important? The weight of those words settled into the room like lead. Someone important. Someone with enough influence to silence an old man's concerns, to bury a story that should have been front-page news. Marcus felt the familiar burn of injustice in his chest, the same fire that had driven him to become a detective in the first place. Ranger suddenly stood, his body language shifting from alert observation to active investigation. He moved toward the wall that had captured his attention, his nose working systematically along the baseboard, up the corner seam, following invisible trails that told a story Marcus was only beginning to understand. The sound that emerged from behind that wall was subtle, a soft whine that seemed to come from the building itself, as if the very foundation was finally ready to confess its 45-year secret. But Marcus knew better. He knew that sound came from Ranger's throat, a recognition call that spoke of something found, something that had been waiting decades to be discovered. Mr. Kowalski, Marcus said softly, I need you to tell me who told you to keep quiet about what you found. The old man's eyes met his, and in them Marcus saw not just the confusion of Alzheimer's, but the clarity of truth finally ready to emerge from its long darkness. Dr. William Henley, Stanley whispered. He ran this place back then, said it would cause a scandal, destroy the reputation of the home, hurt all the residents who depended on this place for care. The name meant nothing to Marcus, but he knew it would before this day was over. He knew that somewhere in the archives, in the old newspapers and city records, Dr. William Henley's influence would be documented, his connections mapped, his ability to cover up the impossible explained. Ranger's whine grew more insistent, and Marcus realized that whatever lay behind that wall had been calling out for justice for 45 years, waiting for someone, for some dog with the sensitivity to hear its silent plea. The afternoon light was fading fast, casting the room in shadows that seemed to dance with the weight of revealed secrets, and Marcus knew that Sarah Elizabeth Morrison was about to come home at last. By the time Marcus was 14, he'd learned that some neighborhoods swallowed people whole. Growing up in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco, he'd watched friends disappear into addiction, violence, or simply the grinding poverty that wore souls down to nothing. His own father had vanished when Marcus was 12, leaving behind only empty beer bottles and the lingering scent of disappointment that seemed to cling to their apartment's walls like cigarette smoke. It was Mrs. Chen from downstairs, no relation, despite the shared surname. Hood changed everything. She'd found him trying to break into cars for food, money, and, instead of calling the police, had made him a deal. Work at the animal shelter where she volunteered, and she'd make sure he ate every day. That's where he'd met his first police dog, a retired German shepherd named Duke, who'd been injured in the line of duty and needed a gentle hand during recovery. Duke had been Marcus's introduction to the language of trust, to the way loyalty could exist without words, to the understanding that some partnerships transcended species. The old dog had taught an angry teenager that strength didn't always mean fighting, that sometimes the bravest thing was knowing when to be still, when to listen, when to protect something more vulnerable than yourself. Years later, when Marcus graduated from the police academy and was offered a choice between patrol and canine unit, he thought of Duke's graying muzzle and wise amber eyes. The decision was never really in question. Ranger had been 3 years old when they'd first been partnered, a high-energy German shepherd, with intelligence that bordered on uncanny and a work ethic that put most humans to shame. Their first case together had been a missing child, a 4-year-old boy who'd wandered away from a family picnic in Golden Gate Park. While other officers searched with flashlights and called out names, Ranger had simply put his nose to the ground and followed a trail that existed in dimensions Marcus could barely imagine. They'd found little Jimmy Peterson sleeping under a grove of eucalyptus trees, 2 miles from where he'd last been seen, covered by a homeless man's jacket. The man, a Vietnam veteran named Carl, had found the boy crying and disoriented, had kept him safe through a cold San Francisco night, waiting for help to arrive. Marcus had learned something that day about jumping to conclusions, about the difference between protection and predation, about trusting his partner's judgment over his own preconceptions. Over the following years, Marcus and Ranger had become something more than partners. They'd become a single investigative unit with 4 legs and 2 hearts. They'd tracked escaped convicts through the Marin headlands, located evidence in cases that had stymied other detectives, found missing persons who'd been written off as lost causes. But they'd also experienced the failures, the cases that went cold despite their best efforts, the times when even Ranger's extraordinary abilities weren't enough to overcome human cruelty or bureaucratic indifference. The case that had changed Marcus most profoundly came 3 years into their partnership. 80-year-old Maria Santos had disappeared from her school playground during recess, vanishing in broad daylight with dozens of potential witnesses. The initial investigation had focused on stranger abduction, on sex offenders and known predators, following all the standard protocols that usually yielded results. But Ranger had been restless during those first few days, displaying behavior that Marcus had learned to interpret as frustration. The dog would start tracking, then stop abruptly, circling back on himself as if following scents that made no logical sense. It wasn't until the 4th day that Marcus realized what his partner was trying to tell him. The trail didn't lead away from the school. It led back to it. They'd found Maria in a maintenance tunnel beneath the school's foundation, placed there by a custodian who'd been molesting her for months. The man had intended to let her die, to make it appear as though she'd crawled into the tunnel and become lost. But Maria was still alive when they found her, barely conscious but breathing, saved by Ranger's refusal to accept the obvious explanation. That case had taught Marcus something fundamental about his partnership with Ranger. The dog didn't just find what was lost, he found what was hidden. There was a difference, a crucial distinction that separated mere scent tracking from true investigation. Ranger could sense deception, could detect the emotional residue of guilt and fear that lingered in places where terrible things had been concealed. The missing children cases had begun to wear on both of them after that. Each successful rescue was balanced by cases that ended badly, by children they found too late, by families whose lives were shattered beyond repair. Marcus had started drinking more than he should, started having dreams where he was the one lost, the one calling for help that never came. It was during one of those dark periods that they'd been assigned to cold cases, the unsolved mysteries that haunted every police department like unquiet ghosts. Sarah Morrison's file had been sitting in a box for 30 years by then, reviewed periodically by different detectives who'd found nothing new to pursue. Her case had all the elements that made investigations nearly impossible. No body, no witnesses, no physical evidence, no clear motive. But Marcus had learned to see cold cases differently than other detectives. Where they saw dead ends, he saw opportunities for Ranger's unique abilities. Old crimes left emotional scars in locations, traumas that somehow embedded themselves in the very environment where they'd occurred. Ranger could detect those scars. Decades after the original investigators had given up hope, they'd worked a dozen cold cases over the past 2 years, with limited success. Some trails were simply too old, too degraded by time and circumstance. But occasionally, very occasionally, they'd find something, a buried piece of evidence, a witness who'd been overlooked, a connection that previous investigators had missed. Sarah Morrison's case had been different from the beginning. There was something about the circumstances of her disappearance that had never made sense. A 7-year-old doesn't simply vanish from her own backyard without someone noticing something. The original investigation had focused on the family, then on neighbors, then on registered offenders in the area. But no one had ever considered the possibility that Sarah might have been taken somewhere familiar, somewhere she might have gone willingly with someone she trusted. Marcus had spent weeks reviewing the case file, mapping Sarah's daily routines, talking to surviving family members and friends who remembered that terrible summer of 1978. Her grandmother had worked various part-time jobs to supplement her Social Security income, including a stint in the kitchen at Willowbrook Nursing Home. Sarah had sometimes accompanied her during school breaks, a bright little girl who'd charmed residents and staff alike. It was a thin connection, the kind of lead that most detectives would dismiss as circumstantial. But Marcus had learned to trust the threads that others ignored, to follow the paths that seemed too coincidental to matter, because in his experience, coincidence was often truth wearing a disguise. Now, sitting in Stanley Kowalski's room with Ranger's tension vibrating through the air like electricity, Marcus felt the familiar convergence of instinct and evidence that marked the moments when cold cases began to thaw. The missing pieces were finally arranging themselves into a pattern, and that pattern was pointing toward a truth that had been waiting 45 years to emerge from its hiding place behind a wall. Ranger's sudden movement broke Marcus from his thoughts, the dog rising to his feet, with purpose and padding toward the built-in bookshelf with predatory focus. His nose worked systematically along the wooden panels, his body language broadcasting a message that Marcus had learned to read with perfect clarity. Something was here, something important, something that had been deliberately hidden from view. The late afternoon shadows were lengthening now, and Marcus knew they were running out of daylight, but he also knew they were running toward something that couldn't wait another day, couldn't remain buried for another hour. Somewhere behind that wall, Sarah Elizabeth Morrison was waiting to be found, and Ranger had finally picked up her trail. The first sign that Ranger had found something came as a low, continuous whine that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep in his chest, a sound Marcus had heard only a handful of times in their 5 years together, always when his partner detected human remains. The German Shepherd's nose worked methodically along the base of the bookshelf, his entire body trembling with controlled energy, every muscle coiled with the tension of discovery. Mrs. Henderson, Marcus called softly into the hallway, not wanting to break Ranger's concentration but needing answers that only the facility director could provide. "Could you come in here for a moment?" The woman appeared in the doorway, her face pale with growing concern as she took in Ranger's behavior and Stanley Kowalski's tear-stained cheeks. "Is everything all right? I need to know about the construction history of this room," Marcus said, his detective instincts taking over even as his heart hammered against his ribs. Specifically, was this area ever modified or renovated? Mrs. Henderson's hands fluttered nervously at her sides.
I'd have to check the records.
"But I believe this wing underwent significant renovations in the early 80s. Room expansions, modernization of the heating systems. Stanley Kowalski made a sound that was part laugh, part sob. 1981, he said with the clarity that sometimes cuts through dementia like a blade. "They hired contractors to do the work, but I had to prepare the spaces, had to clear out the old storage areas and utility rooms behind these walls." Ranger's whine intensified, his paws scratching at the junction where the bookshelf met the wall. Marcus knelt beside his partner, running his hands along the wooden panels, feeling for irregularities, for seams that might indicate hidden openings. His fingers found what his eyes had missed, a section of trim that sat slightly proud of the wall, as if it had been installed to cover something rather than to decorate. "Mr. Kowalski, I need you to think very carefully," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "When you were preparing this space for renovation, what exactly did you find?" The old man's face crumpled again, decades of suppressed memory flooding back with devastating clarity. She was in the storage room behind there, curled up like she was sleeping, still in that little red dress, but she wasn't sleeping. She'd been there for years already, maybe from right after she disappeared. The words hit the room like physical blows, each revelation more terrible than the last. Mrs. Henderson gasped, her hand flying to cover her mouth, but Marcus found himself focused on the logistics, the cold details that would be necessary to understand how such a thing could remain hidden for so long. "How did she get there?" he asked. Stanley's hands worked at his robe again, his fingers remembering the texture of fear that had lived with him for 45 years. The storage room had an outside entrance, a delivery door that connected to the old service tunnel. Someone who knew the building layout could have brought her in that way. Could have... He stopped, unable to finish the thought. But Marcus could finish it. Someone familiar with Meadowbrook Nursing Home's layout had lured or taken Sarah Morrison there, had hidden her body in a space that should have been discovered during routine maintenance but somehow hadn't been. And when Stanley had finally found her, that same someone had possessed enough influence to ensure the discovery was covered up. The evidence concealed behind a wall that was scheduled for renovation anyway. "Dr. Henley," Marcus said, the name feeling like poison on his tongue. "Tell me about Dr. Henley." Stanley's eyes cleared again, focusing on Marcus with laser intensity. He was the medical director then, but he had other interests. Real estate development, city planning commissions. He owned property all over town, had connections with contractors, building inspectors, city officials. "When I found the little girl and told him, he said it would be handled properly, said the authorities would be notified, but they never would. No. The next day, a construction crew sealed up that storage room, made it disappear like it never existed." Dr. Henley told me that involving the police would destroy the nursing home, would put dozens of elderly residents out on the street. He said some secrets were better left buried. Ranger's behavior was becoming more agitated now, his scratching at the wall more insistent. Marcus could see scratches in the wood where the dog's claws had found purchase, could hear the hollow sound that indicated empty space behind the panels. 45 years of concealment were about to come to an end, Mrs. Henderson. I need you to contact the coroner's office and request a forensic team, Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. And I'll need you to have maintenance locate the building. Plans from 1981 were going to need to know exactly how this wall was constructed. The facility director nodded numbly, her professional composure cracking under the weight of what was being revealed. Should I evacuate the other residents? Not yet, but clear this hallway, and make sure no one enters this room without authorization. Marcus stood, his hand finding Ranger's head, fingers scratching behind the dog's ears in the gesture of praise that meant a job well done. Good boy, Ranger, good boy. But even as he spoke the words of commendation, Marcus felt the cold certainty that they were only at the beginning of this story. Finding Sarah Morrison's remains would close one case, but it would open another, the investigation into how her death had been covered up, how a 7-year-old girl's murder had been hidden for nearly half a century. Dr. William Henley would have been in his 40s in 1978, old enough to have established the connections necessary for such a cover-up, young enough to still be alive now. The thought sent ice through Marcus's veins. If Henley was still alive, he'd spent 45 years believing he'd gotten away with murder. Ranger's whining had changed pitch, becoming more urgent, more demanding. The dog's amber eyes met Marcus's, and in them was a message that transcended species, transcended the limitations of human speech. The scent behind that wall wasn't just old death, it was injustice, pure and concentrated, calling out for resolution after decades of silence. As if responding to some invisible signal, Ranger suddenly sat back on his haunches and released a single, piercing howl that seemed to echo through the entire facility. It was a sound Marcus had never heard from his partner before, primal and haunting. The cry of something wild, acknowledging the discovery of something that should never have been lost. On the silence that followed, Marcus could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the weight of Sarah Morrison's file in his hands, could sense the presence of a little girl who'd been waiting 45 years for someone to care enough to find her. The truth was finally coming to light, but Marcus knew that before this was over, more secrets would be exposed, more graves would be opened, and justice would demand a price that someone had thought they'd never have to pay. The forensic team arrived as the November sun disappeared behind the hills surrounding Willowbrook Nursing Home, their van's headlights cutting through the early evening, darkness like searchlights seeking truth in shadow. Dr. Patricia Reeves, the county's chief medical examiner, moved through the facility's corridors with the efficient grace of someone who'd spent 30 years coaxing secrets from bones and buried evidence. Marcus watched from the hallway as the team set up their equipment, their movements precise and methodical. Ranger sat beside him, alert but calmer now, his initial agitation having given way to the patient watchfulness of a predator who'd successfully cornered his prey. The dog's work was done for the moment, but Marcus knew his partner would remain vigilant, ready to detect whatever else this place might be hiding. Detective Chen, Dr. Reeves approached, pulling off latex gloves that were already dusty from her preliminary examination of the wall structure. Your dog was right. Ground-penetrating radar shows a void space approximately 6 feet by 4 feet behind that bookshelf, roughly 3 feet below floor level. The construction suggests it was a basement storage room that was sealed during renovation. The technical details felt surreal, reducing a little girl's death to measurements and architectural specifications. But Marcus had learned to find comfort in facts, in the solid evidence that made prosecution possible. How long to access it? Carefully, several hours. The wall appears to have been professionally sealed concrete block, then drywall, then the bookshelf installation. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. Dr. Reeves paused, studying Marcus's face. Detective, given the age of this case and the circumstances, are you prepared for what we might find in there? Marcus thought of Sarah Morrison's family, of the parents who'd died never knowing what happened to their daughter, of siblings who'd grown old carrying the weight of unanswered questions. He thought of Stanley Kowalski, living with 45 years of enforced silence, and of Dr. William Henley, who'd believed his secret was buried too deep to ever surface. "Do what you need to do," he said. The next 3 hours passed with agonizing slowness. Marcus had sent Mrs. Henderson home after ensuring that the rest of the facility remained sealed off from the investigation. Stanley Kowalski had been relocated to a different room, though the old man had begged to stay. To see the end of the story he'd been forced to help write decades ago. By 10 o'clock, the forensic team had carefully removed the bookshelf and begun the methodical process of dismantling the wall. Each layer revealed more evidence of deliberate concealment. The concrete had been professionally poured, the drywall expertly installed, the entire construction designed to last for decades without revealing what lay beneath. Ranger had remained at Marcus's side throughout the process, occasionally rising to investigate new scents or sounds, but always returning to his position, as if understanding that his presence was needed more than his active participation. The dog's calm vigilance had become Marcus's anchor, a reminder that justice sometimes required patience as much as it required action. When the final section of concrete was lifted away, Dr. Reeves motioned for Marcus to join her at the edge of what had once been a storage room and was now a tomb. The space was smaller than he'd expected, barely large enough for a child to lie down, with rough concrete walls and a floor that sloped slightly toward a drain that had long since been sealed. And there, in the corner furthest from where the wall had been breached, lay the remains of Sarah Elizabeth Morrison. 45 years had reduced her to bones and fragments of faded fabric, but the red polka dot dress was still recognizable. Its cheerful pattern a heartbreaking contrast to the terrible circumstances of its preservation. A small skull, delicate and obviously belonging to a child, rested where her head would have been, and Marcus felt something break inside his chest at the sight. Preliminary examination suggests no obvious trauma to the skeletal remains, Dr. Reeves said softly, her professional demeanor unable to completely mask the emotion in her voice. "We'll know more after a complete forensic analysis, but—" She gestured toward a corner of the room where something glinted in the harsh work lights. Marcus followed her gaze and felt his blood turn to ice. Scattered around Sarah's remains were other objects: a child's bracelet, a small toy car, a hair ribbon that had once been white but had yellowed with age. But it was the adult-sized items that made his detective instincts flare with terrible understanding. A man's wristwatch, expensive and distinctive, and a ring bearing what appeared to be a medical symbol. "There's more," Dr. Reeves continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Look at the walls." Marcus directed his flashlight toward the concrete surfaces and immediately saw what she meant. Scratches covered the walls at child height, desperate claw marks that spoke of someone who'd been trapped, who'd fought against confinement until strength and hope were exhausted. But there was something else: words scratched into the concrete, with what might have been a small stone or piece of metal. "Help me," Marcus read aloud, his voice cracking slightly. The letters were crude, obviously carved by a child's hand, but clearly legible even after 45 years. Below those words was a name, scratched with the same desperate determination: Sarah. The implications hit him like physical blows. Sarah Morrison hadn't been killed immediately, and hidden she'd been imprisoned here, trapped in this concrete box, while she slowly died of dehydration, starvation, or simple terror. The scratches on the walls told a story of hours or days of desperate attempts to escape, of a 7-year-old girl who'd fought until the very end. Ranger suddenly appeared at Marcus's elbow, the dog having somehow navigated the excavation site to join him beside Sarah's grave. The German shepherd's behavior was different, no calmer, but more focused, as if he understood that his work had shifted from detection to memorial. He sat beside the opening, head bowed slightly, in what looked remarkably like a gesture of respect. "Detective," Dr. Reeves said, holding up an evidence bag containing the wristwatch. "This is a Rolex Submariner, probably from the mid-1970s. Custom engraving on the back, to William, with love and admiration, MHA, 1975. Marcus felt the final piece of the puzzle click into place with awful certainty. Dr. William Henley hadn't just covered up Sarah's death, he'd been responsible for it. The watch, the medical ring, the professional nature of the concealment it all pointed to a man who'd had both the means and the opportunity to commit this crime and then hide it behind a wall of institutional authority and bureaucratic indifference. "We need to find Dr. Henley," Marcus said, though part of him wondered if justice was even possible after so many decades. "And we need to find out if there are other victims." As if responding to his words, Ranger stood and moved toward a different section of the excavated room, his nose working methodically along the floor. The dog's tail remained still, his ears pricked forward with the same intensity that had led them to Sarah in the first place. Marcus felt his heart sink as understanding dawned. Ranger wasn't finished. The German Shepherd's behavior suggested that Sarah Morrison's remains weren't the only secrets hidden within Meadowbrook Nursing Home's walls. After 45 years, the building was finally ready to confess all of its buried sins, and Marcus realized that this investigation was just beginning. The sound that emerged from Ranger's throat was different from his earlier lurchty, more mournful, as if the dog understood that they'd found not just one lost child, but the beginning of a pattern that stretched back decades into the facility's dark history. The investigation into Dr. William Henley began at dawn the next morning, but within 2 hours, Marcus learned that conventional justice would be impossible. The man who'd murdered Sarah Morrison and covered up her death had died 3 years earlier at the age of 91, taking his secrets to the grave and leaving behind only a carefully constructed legacy of community service and medical dedication. Marcus sat in his cluttered downtown office, surrounded by boxes of files that now seemed to connect in ways he'd never imagined. Ranger lay beside his desk, the dog's presence a steady comfort as Marcus worked through the implications of what they